afternoon. My name is Tessie Rose, and I'm pleased to welcome you to the High School Response to Intervention Progress Monitoring webinar on behalf of the High School Tiered Interventions Initiative. The High School Tiered Interventions Initiative, which you refer to as HSTII, is a collaborative effort among the National Center on Response to Intervention, the National High School Center, and the Center on Instruction that explores how RTI and tiered interventions are being implemented at the high school level. We are pleased you could join us today. We will be getting started in just a few minutes, but before we begin, we would like to review a few technical details about today's event and offer a few suggestions and guidelines. We trust that you have had success logging into the technology, but if you encounter any technical difficulties at any point during today's session, we ask that you contact Live Meeting Technical Support Staff at 1-866-493-2825. The number is posted in the Q&A window for your convenience. Please use the question and answer window throughout this session to type a question regarding technical issues or presentation content. The Q&A tab is located at the top of your screen. Once you open the tab, in order to type in a question, place your cursor in the smaller box on the top. Type your question and click Ask. Please note that it will be anonymous and no names will appear in the question box. If you prefer that your question be answered privately, please specify in the text box. The presenters will leave time at the end of the session to read questions and provide an oral answer. Please note that the webinar software allows you to type another question only when your previous question has been answered. We are pleased to have our event captioned in live time by a captioner who is joining us online today. You might have noticed that a special box popped up on your screen when you first entered the session. That is where you will be able to access the real-time captioning transcript. We encourage you to resize the captioning window to a size that suits your needs by clicking on the top of the box and dragging it with your mouse, or closing the box if you prefer not to view it. A quick note about the audio portion of this session. We will be recording this event so that it can be available online for those who missed it today. In order to produce the best quality recording, we have muted all of the phone lines to minimize background noise. If you have a comment or question for our presenter, please use the question and answer tab at the top of the screen. Before we hear from today's speaker, Lou Danielson from the National High School Center and the National Center on Response to Intervention will provide a brief overview of the High School Tiered Intervention Initiative.
Good afternoon, everyone. We're going to give a little bit of background on this initiative. For those of you who've participated in some of the previous webinars that we've done related to this initiative, this information will be information that you've heard before. I might note, though, that this is one of several webinars that we've conducted already, and for those of you that have not heard earlier webinars that go into broader detail about some of what we've learned through this initiative, these webinars are accessible to you on the RTI Center website, which is you'll see on the screen at the very end of the presentation. So we won't be going through all of the background that we've covered through previous webinars. So briefly then, this is a collaboration of three national technical assistance centers. The Center on Instruction Special Ed Strand that's located at the University of Texas at Austin. The National Center on Response Intervention, which is located here at the American Institutes for Research. And the National High School Center, which is also located here at the American Institutes for Research. The goal of this tiered intervention initiative is to enhance the understanding of how tiered intervention models are emerging at the high school level. As we began this initiative, there had not been very much research conducted and not very much known about what RTI looked like at the high school level, how it was being implemented, and how it was emerging, the degree to which it looked like RTI at the elementary school level. So this initiative was really designed then to look in some ways kind of bottom up. How are schools that were implementing RTI implementing it? What are the variety of approaches they're using, and that work has largely been completed. We contacted 51 high schools through a nomination process They included state-level people as well as a variety of the national centers that are in contact with states and districts around the country, resulted in 51 high schools being nominated. We interviewed administrators in 20 of these high schools. So some of our information is based on those interviews. We also convened a technical advisory group that consisted of some of the leading people doing RTI work, as well as people that do work at a high school level. And then we finally conducted 8 site visits where at least 2 of our staff went on site and conducted extensive interviews and observed what was happening in high schools. And we previously reported on many of our observations from that work. One of the things we will do today is to then focus in more specifically on one of the topics that people we know are quite interested in, which is progress monitoring and what that looks like at the high school level, both in terms of what schools are doing, as well as some more general information about RTI and progress monitoring and some of what we know from a research and development perspective.
Okay. Thank you, Lou. Today we're fortunate to have Kristen McMaster from the University of Minnesota, Mira Goebel, Casey Monahan, and Maria Garcia from Walla Walla, Washington High School. Our first speaker is Dr. Kristen McMaster, Associate Professor of Special Education in the Department of Educational Psychology, University of Minnesota. She received her MED and her PhD in Special Education from Vanderbilt University. Her research interests include creating conditions for successful response to intervention of students at risk, students with disabilities, and students from culturally and linguistically diverse backgrounds. Specific research focuses on, 1, promoting teachers' use of database decision-making and evidence-based instruction, and 2, developing individualized interventions for students for whom generally effective instruction is not sufficient. I will now turn the presentation over to Dr. McMaster.
Thank you, and good afternoon, everybody. I'm very excited to be part of this webinar today. So just to give a little overview of what I'll be talking about this afternoon, I'll first just talk very briefly about some things to consider in selecting a progress monitoring approach at high school level. But I'll move pretty quickly into specifics about curriculum-based measurement, which is one approach to progress monitoring. I'll give a brief overview of CBM, and then I'll talk more specifically about CBM tools that are available and have been researched at the high school level, and then I'll talk specifically about how to go about developing CBM tools. So first of all, in terms of selecting a progress monitoring approach, obviously it will depend on the purpose that the school would like to monitor progress for. If the purpose is to monitor attendance or behavior, oftentimes schools will use attendance, office referrals, or behavioral observations. If the purpose is more to look at students' mastery of specific content, then it may be appropriate to use grades, test scores, performance on competencies or standards in the different content areas. And then finally, if the purpose is to monitor students' overall proficiency in the basic skills they need to access the curriculum, then measures such as general outcome measures and more specifically curriculum-based measurement may be appropriate. And again, this last approach is the one that will be the focus of my presentation today. So I'll give just a brief overview of CBM, first just talking about the general purpose and some of the research that's been done, and I'll give a little demonstration of the way that it is designed to work in progress monitoring. So to start, CBM was designed to be a simple, efficient set of standard procedures. And by standard, I mean that we always administer and score CBM measures in the same way. So they're always done in a consistent way so that we get objective, quantifiable data regarding student performance. So CBM is objective, which might be a benefit over student grades, which can often be subjective based on the subject matter or the teacher that's giving the grades. CBM is really designed to be an objective, quantifiable way of looking at student behaviors. Basically, we count student behaviors when we're administering CBM. CBM allows for comparison of students to their peers and to grade level benchmarks. And the particular benefits for CBM in the context of progress monitoring is that they allow for repeated measurement and they show student growth over time. And this is especially critical if we are going to be making decisions about whether students are responding to instruction and whether we need to change instruction. I think these days schools are moving towards looking at student growth, and some of even the high-stakes measures that we give can be given 3 times a year, and that's good. The problem with only giving measures 3 times a year is that we might need to wait for an entire semester before we know that a student isn't making the kind of progress that they need to meet grade level benchmarks or to be ready to graduate in a timely fashion. And especially in high school, when we have very limited time with students, it's important that we can quickly gauge how they're responding to intervention and make instructional decisions if that's needed. Another important point in thinking about the purpose of CBM is that CBM was really designed to reflect vital signs of academic health. And by that, it's sort of like taking a child's temperature. We take a child's temperature to find out if something is wrong. It doesn't necessarily tell us exactly what is wrong, but it tells us that the student isn't making sufficient progress and that we might need to do something more to address that student's particular needs. And once we know that a student isn't making sufficient growth, then we know that we need to look maybe more at students' assignments that they're doing in their classes. Maybe we even need to give some diagnostic testing to find out what their specific needs are. So CBM is really a way to kind of give us this indicator that they're either doing fine or that they're not making sufficient progress and more investigation is needed. Now, CBM was developed by Stan Dino and his colleagues at the University of Minnesota back in the late 70s to mid-80s at the Institute for Research on Learning Disabilities. That's when CBM first started to be developed. And all of the research that's been conducted on CBM has subscribed to these particular basic criteria. First, that CBM measures must be technically adequate. So they need to be reliable and valid measures of student performance and progress. They need to be sensitive to growth. If the goal is to look at student progress over time, they need to show that progress. And also they need to be practical. So they need to be easy to use and understand so teachers can look at the data and know what they mean and communicate the data to other people. They need to be brief, because if we are going to give them on a frequent basis, they can't take all of the instructional time. And they need to be repeatable. We need to be able to give them over and over again so we get this picture of progress over time. Now, since CBM was first developed, there's been many years of research focusing on different areas of academic performance, reading, math, written expression, and the content areas. In the overall picture of CBM research, there are relatively few studies focusing on high school students, although you'll see further in the presentation that there is a growing evidence base for CBM measures at high school. Much of this research addresses the reliability and validity of the measures, and some of it looks at the use of the measures to monitor progress. And I'll go into some more depth as we look at specific examples of progress measures. If you're interested in reviews of the research in CBM, there's a special issue of the Journal of Special Education from the summer of 2007, and there's literature reviews of CBM in reading, written expression, and math in that volume. Now, before I get into the specifics about high school CBM, I just wanted to give a little illustration of what CBM looks like when we use it to monitor student progress. So, first of all, if you look at number 1 here, the first thing to do is to determine the student's current level of performance. So we might collect baseline data, and often in using CBM data, we collect 3 data points and take the median so that we have, that's usually a fairly stable estimate. Oftentimes students will vary in their performance, so it's important to get as stable an estimate as possible. So we often collect 3 data points. And then the second thing is to set an annual goal for the student. And that goal is oftentimes tied to general education standards. So if we know that in order to pass the state standards test or to meet a certain level of proficiency, the student needs to read, in this case, they need to be able to make 50 correct maze choices, and I'll explain what that means. We'd set that as our goal. And so then we draw a line from their present level of performance to that end-of-year goal. Then the next step would be to monitor the individual progress of the student towards that goal. And in this example, we can see that the student has somewhat variable progress, and after a while, they seem to be declining in their progress. And at that point, we might decide that the instruction that's happening here is not sufficient to help the student meet their end-of-year goal. So that would indicate to us that we need to make an instructional change. And that instructional change might be based on additional information that we collect. Again, we might look at the students' assignments in particular coursework that they're doing and try to figure out what is it that the student is having difficulties with. And at that point, we might modify the kinds of instruction that they're receiving. We might move them to a more intensive level of instruction. But the whole idea is that we make an instructional change, that we're not going to wait until the end of the year to find out that the student is failing, but we're going to change instruction here and now and continue to monitor their progress to make sure that that change in instruction is effective. So in this example, then we see that after changing instruction, the student makes much better progress such that they're exceeding their annual goal by the end of the year. So that's kind of the idea of how we would use CBM to monitor student progress. So now I'm going to give some more specific examples of CBM tools that have been developed for the high school level. One of the most common approaches to doing CBM is giving a read-aloud task, and this is often used at the elementary level and has also been examined for students at the high school level. So basically, students have a grade-level passage, and they read that passage aloud for 1 minute to an examiner, and the examiner has a separate copy of the measure, and they count the number of words that the student reads correctly. And so they're crossing out words that the student makes mistakes on, and in the end, they count the number of words the student read in that 1 minute. The research that's been done at the high school level is fairly slim with the read-aloud task, and much of that work has been done by Kristen McMaster, who used to be here at the University of Minnesota. And basically what they found in their research is that the read-aloud task has fairly strong reliability and validity, and in terms of validity, I mean criterion-referenced validity, the way that the read-aloud task compares to other standard measures of reading. So reliability and validity has been quite strong for the read-aloud task. The problem is that the measure is not particularly sensitive to growth for older students. So in terms of progress monitoring, it might not be as useful as other types of tasks. One thing that I should mention, though, in the study that's listed at the bottom of the slide there, Espin, Wallace, Lemke, Campbell, and Long, they actually developed a procedure where you can estimate the likelihood of a student passing a state standards test based on their current level on the CBM reading task. And that article there, there's a full citation to it. If you're interested in finding out how to predict how well students are going to do on standard tests using read aloud scores, there is a description of those procedures. But again, I would like to emphasize that in terms of progress monitoring, read aloud turns out not to be the best measure. So instead, there's another approach to progress monitoring and reading, which is the maze task. And this is very much like the read aloud task, except that the student reads silently. Again, this is a timed task. It should be administered for 2 to 3 minutes, and that time should always be kept constant. And on this measure, every 7th word is deleted and replaced with multiple choices. And the student's job is to circle the correct word, and then their score is the number of correct word selections that they made in the allotted time. The research on this maze task, again, the reliability and validity is fairly strong, and the benefit of this measure is that it has been shown to be sensitive to growth of high school students. Another benefit of this measure is that it can be group administered, so it's a more efficient approach because the examiner can give the instructions and a number of students can take the measure all at once. This measure also tends to have a little bit more face validity with teachers because there's sort of a more obvious element of comprehension. The students need to be able to understand what they're reading in order to make the correct selections. In the area of math, there's been less research conducted than in reading. The measures that exist in math include basic facts and estimation, but that research is more done at the K through grade 8 levels. If you have students that are still working at basic math levels, those measures might be appropriate. But then at the high school level, Dr. Ann Fagan at Iowa State University has been doing some fairly meticulous work to develop measures in algebra, and she has a set of algebra measures that look at basic skills, and that's what the example is showing here, and also a measure of algebraic foundation, so things like finding the slope of a line or solving equations, things like that. So she has been developing a set of algebra measures and has some good preliminary evidence of the reliability, validity, and sensitivity to growth of those measures. Later in the presentation, I do have a link to her website, and you can see more examples of the measures that she's developed and get more information about those tools as well. And then in the area of written expression, that's probably where there's been the most substantial amount of research done, again by Christine Espen and her colleagues. And with this approach, students respond to a writing prompt for anywhere from 5 to 10 minutes, and those prompts are scored for using a procedure that we call correct minus incorrect word sequences. And I'll say a little bit more about that later. It takes some direction and some practice to learn to do the correct minus incorrect word sequence procedure. It basically takes into account both spelling and grammar of students' writing, but it's still a quantitative procedure that can be used to show growth over time. Research on written expression measures has indicated fairly good reliability and validity of the measures, not as strong as in reading, but for writing measures, sufficient reliability and validity for progress monitoring. The measures have been shown to be sensitive to growth, although there's not as much research in that area, and certainly we would benefit from more research confirming that the measures are sensitive to growth. And there's also some evidence that longer writing samples may be better for older kids. So 5 to 7 minutes and even 10 minutes might produce better writing samples than more brief samples. and also expository samples as opposed to narrative samples. And I'll show some examples of the difference between those two types a little bit later. And finally, again, Chris Espin and her colleagues have developed some vocabulary matching tools that can be used in science and social studies content areas. And basically, the vocabulary matching approach involves matching content area terms with definitions, again, within a constant time, 5 minutes. And there's a bit of research on vocabulary matching that indicates that they have fairly decent validity and they are sensitive to student progress over time. So now I'll talk just a little bit more about how one might go about actually developing these tools. There's some general principles for developing CBM measures. First of all, of course, we would want to identify the domain in which we're going to monitor student progress. So is it in reading, math, writing, in the content areas? And next, we're going to sample from the curriculum in which students are learning. And the idea is really to take the whole curriculum and assess students on that whole curriculum each time we administer a measure. And so the CBM measures are presumably going to include information that students don't know or haven't practiced, as well as students or information that they have learned. And so over time, you'll see them making progress on the measures as they learn more and more from the curriculum. And then third, it's important to create alternate forms that are of the same difficulty level, again, so that we can see progress on the measures over time. So in reading, if you're interested in developing a maze task, the first step would be to select a reading passage that is at the desired grade level. And it's really important to keep that grade level consistent, again, because we want to be able to see progress over time. So if we have an easier passage one week and a more difficult passage the next week, the student is going to perform differently on those passages, not because their progress is changing, but because the passages are different in difficulty level. So they should be as close as possible in difficulty level. And in terms of what passages to select, you can use text that the students would be reading as part of their curriculum. If it's from, they're using an anthology, content area text. Actually, in the research, oftentimes newspaper passages have been used, which tend to be fairly consistent in the grade level or the readability level. But again, the multiple passages should be at similar grade level. Then, as you're developing the maze task, the first sentence in the passage is left intact, and then starting with the second sentence, every seventh word is deleted and replaced with 3 choices, including the correct word and then 2 distractors. So distractors should not be semantically correct in the context of the sentence. They should not rhyme. They should not sound similar to the correct answer, and they should not be visually similar to the correct answer. So the idea is that there is an obvious choice, and thus, if the student is reading well, they'll be able to quickly select the correct choice and move on. In terms of administering and scoring the maze task, the student should be given 2 to 3 minutes to read the passage and make their selections. Again, it's important to always use the same amount of time, so select 2 minutes or 3 minutes and then always stick with that amount of time. And the other thing to consider is that you don't want the students to finish the passage before the time is up. So make sure the passages are long enough so that they still have room to grow, so to speak, as time goes on. And then to score the measures, it's just a matter of simply counting the number of correct choices. For writing prompts, the first step is to determine whether you'll use narrative or expository prompts, so narrative being story prompts, expository being more descriptive writing. Again, once you've decided what type of prompt to use, it's best to use to be consistent in that type of prompt. It's also important to use prompts that will tap the background knowledge of typical high school students, so things that they'll be familiar with. If you're in Florida, you probably don't want to have them write about getting stuck in a snowstorm. So things that are going to be familiar to the students, things that are culturally relevant to the students, things that they'll be able to think and write about. And use simple language, so the prompts don't need to be very complex in their language, just simple and direct. And I'll show some examples in just a second. If you're using narrative prompts, in research, we've used the rule that they should be open-ended, so they sort of present an opportunity for the student to pick up and continue writing the story. For expository prompts, they should prompt the student to describe or explain something. So here are some examples of prompts that we've used in our own research. Narrative prompts, again, being open-ended, such as one night I had a strange dream about ... and then the student writes about the strange dream. Expository, describe a game you like to play and tell why you like it. So it gives students something to think about in terms of what they should write in response to that prompt. In terms of administering and scoring writing prompts, typically we give students paper with the prompt at the top, or it could be written on the board or an overhead. Read the prompt aloud to them, give them 30 seconds to think, and then the specified amount of time that you've determined for them to write. Again, always use the same amount of time. The scoring procedures are more complex than I can explain within the scope of this presentation, but if you're interested in learning how to score correct, minus, and correct word sequences, you can visit the Research Institute on Progress Monitoring website, and the scoring procedures are available to download there. And finally, for developing the vocabulary matching measures, again, this is an approach that's appropriate for content areas like science and social studies. And with this measure, what you would do is you would identify vocabulary terms to be covered within the content area across the term or year. So again, we're sampling from the entire curriculum. And then you would create probes by selecting 22 of the terms randomly from the larger pool. And you'd make multiple probes, so every time that you make a new vocabulary probe, you select 22 new terms randomly from that larger pool of terms. Then you're going to come up with definitions for the terms that can be matched, definitions that can be matched to the terms. And the way that it's been done in research before is having 2 extra terms thrown in there just to be distractors. The definitions can come from textbook glossaries or other teaching materials and should be modified to consist of 15 or fewer words. Then, step 4, it should actually say place the terms or the words in alphabetical order vertically on the left side of the page, and then definitions in random order on the right side of the page, and number them from 1 to 20. So the students will see both the terms and the definitions. And then you'll give the students 5 minutes to read and match the terms with their definitions. Sometimes an administrator would read the terms aloud to students. So if that is the case, then the administrator would first read the entire list of terms, and then they'd read the definitions one at a time at 15-second intervals. And as they're reading, the students would then mark the term with a number that corresponds to each definition. And then finally, you score it by counting the number of correctly matched terms. I won't go into depth as to how to develop math measures. It's probably most easy just to access existing math measures. The basic skills, concepts, and applications measures are available through Vanderbilt University and also through ProEd. So There's contact information there. There's Ames Web Math measures as well as Easy CBM measures, which are available for free download. And then the algebra measures that I mentioned earlier are available from Project Ames, and there's the website there if you're interested in the measures, as well as other information about the development and how to receive training. So here's a list of references to the research that I drew from for this presentation, and I just wanted to mention a few other important considerations. First of all, that CBM data are most useful if they're collected on a regular basis and actually used for instructional decision making. And it's easiest to interpret them when they're graphed, as they were in the example that I gave earlier in the presentation. I would also encourage accessing professional development to learn how to administer and score and interpret CBM data. And a good way to find trainers is through the National Center on Response to Intervention. So that's all I have. Thank you very much for your attention, and I look forward to your questions at the end.
Thank you, Dr. McMaster. For folks on the phone, please remember if you have questions related to what you just heard, use the question and answer window throughout the session to type a question. The Q&A tab, remember, is located at the top of your screen. Once you open the tab, in order to type in a question, place your cursor in the smaller box on top, type your question, and click Ask. Please note that this is anonymous and no names will appear in the question box. If you prefer that your question be answered privately, please specify in the text box. We are fortunate as well to have Mira Goebel, Casey Monahan, and Maria Garcia share their experiences from Walla Walla High School in Washington. Walla Walla High School, a large high school in southeastern Washington, began its RTI efforts in 2003 when literacy first arrived. The school began incorporating rigorous reading instructional strategies, professional development, and database decision-making. Tiered instruction began with English courses in 9th grade and now includes the whole school and has spread to algebra, geometry, and study and organizational skills. Conversation about data occur within professional learning communities where teachers strive to support improved student achievement. With an extended graduation rate of 89% and strong state assessment results in literacy, Walla Walla feels that its RTI framework is yielding positive results. Mira Goebel, the Associate Principal in charge of Curriculum and Assessment and Instruction, Casey Monahan, the English Department Head and an English teacher, and Maria Garcia, the RTI Coordinator and School Psychologist, will be sharing their insights about Walla Walla's RTI framework. Passing it to you guys.
Thank you, Tessie. This is Maria Garcia, and we're so pleased to have been invited today. Thank you. I'd like to start us off by telling the participants up front that Walla Walla High School is not using the curriculum-based measures that Kristen talked about earlier in the presentation, except in our special education department at the current time. I just want everybody to be aware of our current status with respect to the use of those tools. Our special education department does use, at this time, Ames Web products, Oral Reading Fluency, Maze, and then also Fuchs and Fuchs concepts and applications and calculation probes. We're under discussions about how to develop our own Maze passages using our content area text for the upper grades, and how to grow the use of those measures into the general education and Tier 2 programs. So with that, I will pass the baton to Mira Goebel, Associate Principal.
Good afternoon. I just would like to start out by giving you a picture of who we are as a high school, and we are a rural high school, a tiny town in the southeastern corner of Washington State. We're a single high school town, and that, I think, means something to rural high schools, that all eyes are on us. And we have feeder schools, 3 middle schools, and a neighboring high school that also has a middle school that it feeds kids to our high school. Our enrollment in October count is usually about 1,900 students. Our demographics breakdown is that we do have about 30% Hispanic students, but not necessarily transit. Most of our students tend to stay with us for extended years, so we can actually show some growth in their academic performance. 65% students are white, and even though our demographics show that there's 39% free and reduced, we know it's higher because our elementary schools and middle school numbers show we just don't have kids always claiming or completing the forms. About 9% special ed students, and the others that you can see, the other demographics. One of the things that we're proud of is our on-time graduation rate. It's about 87%, and that's one of the things that we do look at. The extended graduation rate is 89%, so we have some students that have come back to us. And our state average is 67% for on-time graduation rate, so we are pretty above in that scenario. Some other things about us is that we do have 96 certificated classroom teachers, and you can see there's some average experience there. We actually have, I think what was the last time we looked at national board certified teachers were, I think about 12 of us out of 96, a pretty big percentage. And so that kind of gives a picture of who our staff are, which obviously has a huge impact on our student learning. So our journey as far as RTI is concerned, as Tessie had mentioned before, it started with a literacy first focus on 2003. And reason that I see that as a starting point is because that really begun that, I call it a second order change, a shift in our thinking about instruction. That's the first time that we brought into the building the idea of that we need to teach reading. We're not English teachers, we're not literature teachers, we're not science teachers, but reading is key to student success. So with the Bill Blocker's Literacy First program, it brought in job-embedded professional development, and we actually designated a couple of our English classes as an intensive reading teacher. Or we had some teachers who went through the intensive reading professional development, and designated a couple of our English classes as that. But as you know, when we implement new things, it also reveals all the things that we're not doing right. And one of that was that we didn't have the right students in front of these great professional development that teachers were receiving. And that's when we started striving for, okay, what data do we need to look at to identify those students who's going to benefit from this great instruction. As we were having that journey in our English department, we also sort of spread that to across the board, where we need to teach reading across the content. So I would say about 70% of our staff members at that time, within 3 years, went through this teaching in content, or teaching across content, teaching reading across content training in science, in our math teachers, some of our PE teachers even, they went through that training. And so that was kind of the beginning of our journey. That led us to looking at data, striving to find some data that is going to tell us what our students can and cannot do in regards to reading. And only data that we had available at that time was our state exam, WASL, which didn't give us much at all. But we started with that, and then we began to use our MAP as one of our screening data, so to speak. But we've also begun to look at some other things like San Diego Quick to identify student reading levels and things that was going on in class. About 3 years into that journey, I think another big support or movement that it came to our school was that idea of professional learning communities. We did a whatever it takes book study across with a bunch of teachers, and they bought into the concept of doing whatever it takes to make sure all students can learn, which just married beautifully with the idea of RTI, which is that question, what do we want our kids to know, identifying the standards. And then second question, how do we know they've learned it? So we begun to develop assessments, common assessments in content areas, and that work began then. And then the third question, which is really about RTI, so what do we do when they don't? And that question, we became our mission statement, not just as a whole school, as a system, so we're going to address students who are not learning, but we want teachers to do that every day in their classroom. When they're designing lessons, that's one of the questions that we want our teachers to ask. What do you want kids to learn today, and how are you going to know it, and what are you going to do today or tomorrow when those kids haven't met those standards or didn't meet the learning targets? So as a system, we have decided to and have begun to address student achievement. So here are some things. Some of the, the columns, RTI, when it came to us, we described it as this big tent. We had all these poles in our school, whether it was PLC work. We've had a lot of professional development and literacy first, GLAD training, differentiated instruction, AVID. Those are different professional development that our staff have been participating in. Some of the other work like curriculum alignment, common assessments, and some of the data-driven student placement. And then we began to really create Tier 2 courses that it met the needs of those kids. And then marrying all that with professional learning committees, those critical questions that we need to ask on a daily basis as a system and as an individual teacher. And RTI provided this tent over all those poles of work that we were doing, and it just made sense to us. And so when we call ourselves an RTI school, it wasn't a big jump. We had to do some things intentionally to allow our staff to see, connecting the dots. Here are all the initiatives and all the work that we're doing, and everything that we're doing really fits under this umbrella of RTI. We're going to respond to students when they're struggling. So some of our Tier 2 intervention classes that we have in place, we started in English classes where we identify students that who are struggling, that they needed to receive core instruction, but what that more is, and that has evolved, what that more looks like. It was through instructional strategies, but we also started to look at our curriculum, which I know Casey is going to talk about that process more. So our journey began in English and providing the Tier 2 intervention classes, but we've actually branched out into math. 3 years ago, we made algebra as our entry point. We used to offer pre-algebra. Prior to that, we realized that that was not going to help our students be successful when they take the state exam as a sophomore, which they need to see algebra and geometry. So when we moved to all students are going to study in algebra, we also realized we're going to have kids coming to us that who is not ready to interact with algebra and be successful. So we created a support class. We identified those bottom quartile kids using math score and provided additional support. So those kids are in algebra class, and then they see the same teacher later on in a support class where there's lots of creative ways to really move them forward so they can be successful when they move into geometry. With guided study that it really focuses on academic, organizational, and just being a successful student, kids who lack those skills. We also are an AVID school. That's an intervention identifying those middle kids that who are underachieving, and we're seeing huge success. It's our 3rd year of AVID. We have credit retrieval classes built into our master schedule. Kids who are credit deficient, we just try to catch them up right there rather than sending to summer school and having that be the only option. We also have twilight school, which occurs after school hours from 3:30 to 5. For those kids who have other issues like attendance, health issues, or become pregnant, how do we get them to stay caught up? So those are all the things, different Tier 2 classes that we have at Walla Walla High School. Some of the challenges, I think most schools, I don't think this is unique to high school, but maybe a couple of them are, just innovative use of funds and resources. How do we, making sacrifices like, and we see it as a sacrifice, we're going to keep our standard level course numbers a little bit higher so we can really keep our Tier 2 classes at 25 or below, and we're going to make sure that we have another adult in there so that intensive instruction can happen. But probably biggest challenge is the paradigm shift of thinking among high school teachers. They usually see themselves as teachers of content, and that's been a shift. You're not only teaching literature, but now you need to teach reading. Earning grades versus learning standards, that's been a big shift. And now our teachers are talking about we really need to get a standards-based grading. And that's exciting to hear teachers talk about that. Also, the whole matching the right teachers or right programs to the right kids. And that has been probably the bulk of our RTI team's work, developing criteria for identifying kids, developing criteria for monitoring their progress and how do we accept them and what's the next step. And that's a conversation we have all year long. Collecting data, understanding data, using data, those are some of the things that, some of the challenges that that we've had to overcome, and when to move kids in and out. How do we keep this fluid so they're not trapped, because we don't want to do that. We want to accelerate their learning and move on into it, but when do we do that? Our master schedule in high school and credits attached to it is always a challenge to make that happen in time, and I think I'm going to have Casey talk about some of the challenges from a classroom teacher perspective.
So this is Casey Monahan, and I teach English at various levels that have started doing the Tier 2. This is my second year. So one of the things that I have been seeing, and actually what I'm going to do is I'm going to jump ahead 2 slides and talk about our English, Tier 2 English offerings. We started looking at, what classes we had been offering to all of our students, and we had such a thing called Basic English. And previously, before we really knew that we were doing RTI, we were trying to hit those kids who were significantly reading below level with different materials. In effect, different curriculum that was not core. And so we pulled in a reading program called Journeys of Voyager, the publisher of these materials, and we were just targeting those students with these materials and these at grade level readings. And then we started to ask the question when we started to realize, oh, well, RTI, that's kind of what we've been doing, and we started to look at what RTI really is, and that these students shouldn't be pulled and separated out and not be given access to the core. So we sat down, Mira somehow found funds and time for all of the Tier 2 English teachers to sit together and talk about what it was that we were doing and the degree to which it was actually meeting the needs of those students. And we decided that what we really needed to do was use our core materials, which are published by McDougall-Littell. It's called McDougall-Littell Literature, which our English department had just adopted the year before. And we decided that if this really was a Tier 2 class where the students were going to get core plus some more, that we needed to be using those materials. So the document that you're seeing right now reflects that work that we did, and I'm thinking this was 2 years ago. In the middle of the school year, we were just kind of assessing what we were already doing. And so, again, kind of what Mira said, we had all these tent poles out there, and we had these activities that were classes that we had and students were in, and we hoped we had the right students. But as time goes on, we've become more and more intentional. So we developed this document that you're seeing in front of you, which identifies the key skills that students are going to need to meet that state benchmark exam, which at the time was called the WASL. They've changed the name on us. And what is the more now is our instructional strategies. So all the teachers who are teaching Tier 2 English have been GLAD trained, GLAD Guided Language Acquisition Design, which is a program out of California. It's truly embedded professional development. We get support in our buildings. We're observed using the strategies. We have time outside of our contract day to review those strategies and to practice using them in front of a trainer. So our more then becomes these strategies, not so much the curriculum, which is we're using the same materials. So after we realized that we were an RTI school, and Maria got us working together as a team, an RTI team, we decided that obviously key to that is having the absolutely exactly right students in front of us and making sure that whatever we might have designed the very best class in the world, but if we don't have the right kids in front of us, then we're targeting the wrong area. So then our RTI team designed this document that is in front of you, which is identifying which students belong in the various classes that we offer here at Walla High. And this is the one just for 9th grade that, and as you can see, it's a draft document. but and we're working on these for all the various levels. But using data, we decide how to place students in these courses. As far as the progress monitoring strategies, as Maria said, we aren't using the Maze or the Ames Web that the SPED classes are using. But what we do is do teacher-designed, ongoing, formative assessments. So, you know, an example might be right now in my 9th grade Tier 2 class, we are working on identifying character traits of characters in short stories, and we've modeled this formative assessment after the state assessment. And I co-teach that class, and we haven't really talked about this model yet, but one of the things that we are doing that I think is very exciting and is working is I co-teach 2 periods a day with the ESL teacher. And our ESL students, from our oral language 1-2 students who are new to country up through students until they exit the program, they are in a co-taught class with a general ed English teacher and a specialty teacher, the ESL teacher. And she and I sit together and we look at the formative assessment and make on-the-spot decisions about instruction. Where are we going to go the next day? Who are we going to split off into smaller groups to work on a specific skill? So, you know, that's the kind of progress monitoring assessments that we're using currently in the English department. And then also, one of the powers of a PLC and the fact that in our school, in our district, we're very lucky to have within our school day programmed in some collaboration time. And so every Wednesday afternoon, the whole school is collaborating. And the English department, I have split out the English department into horizontal teams, and we, in those teams, make common assessments, and then we collect data on, you know, student results, and then we use that data to inform instruction. So those are the kinds of conversations that we're having in those PLCs.
And I think I'm going to jump in here to just point out a couple other slides. This is a similar work that we did in our Tier 3 special English class. And this was a really productive work day as well. Notice that the document is almost identical to what we have created in Tier 2, identifying the screening, progress monitoring, what skills is going to be taught, and what core curriculum that they'll be using, and so forth. I just wanted to talk a little bit about our math because our math teacher is not here to talk about it. But one of the strengths of our math department has been that common assessment. For an example, when algebra became Algebra for All incoming freshmen, that our algebra teachers really spent time creating common unit assignments for every unit. And then they would administer that common assessment. They would score them, and then they'll come back and they've been talking about developing this lessons learned document. What do we learn from this assessment about our students? And the conversation, you know, for an example would be, you know, this question number 4, which is about factoring. Bill, how did your kids do so well versus mine? And so some of those really fantastic conversations have been occurring because of the common assessment. So I know that's happening not only in English, but it's also happening in our math department as well.
Okay, this is Maria. I wanted to share this document. It's a new piece of work that the RTI leadership team has collaboratively done with the assistance of our K-12 math coach. And one of the powerful things about Walla Walla High School's RTI leadership team is the participation of special education, Tier 2. There's representatives from all different programs that might touch kids at our school, and so things that are produced and plans that are made have the input of everyone. This was our first attempt to de-silo, if you will, special education math from what we're doing for general education students. So what we did is we took algebra readiness as a starting point and designed this flow chart, which was intended to provide kids with the skills that they need to eventually, if possible, be successful in algebra and move on to geometry. So the chart emphasizes that it's a flow, and what our hope is that kids can enter this chart at any point, whatever point they're ready for, and they can flow from what class they're in to whatever class they're ready for next, with the hope that we are going to have more kids who are accessing algebra, who are special education, who have learning disabilities in math. Along with this work, of course, goes the kind of parallel work of identifying the curriculum and the standards that are going to be addressed in each of the classes, and that is work that is ongoing, again, with the assistance of our K-12 math coach. One of the things that I hoped to help Walla Walla High School do as we refined our RTI journey is to help them understand what their current status was with respect to our ideal of having the core instruction that would provide kids here with at least 80% success. And so what we did is we took the data that was available on class enrollment. So would the kids that were enrolled in standard or honors or AP, we considered to be Tier 1 or a new tier that we decided to call Tier A. And we calculated the percentage of kids who are in one or more of those standard or honors or AP classes. And you can see that we're pleased to see that we have about 88% of our kids participating in one or more of those courses. We have about 6% of our kids who are supported by one or more Tier 2 class. And then we have about 5% of our kids who are supported by our Tier 3, and we consider our intensive ESL classes as well as special education to be Tier 3. I'd like to point out that on a previous slide you saw that we have 9% of our students in special education, and that 5% in Tier 3 doesn't equal 9%. That's because we do have students identified with disabilities who participate in our Tier 2 classes because that is what they need. So we're doing our best to make it so that Tier 3 does not equal special education. Special education is individualized by the student, and the tiers refer to an increasing level of intensity of support, not a program. This next slide shows our assessment data, our state assessment data over time. And what I've done is I've shown for your comparison what the state average has been since 2003 in reading, math, and writing, and science. And then in the rightmost column of each area is Walla Walla High School's percent passing the state assessment in those areas. And I've highlighted in green those years and those subject areas where our students exceeded the state average. And you can see that we've had very good success in exceeding the state average, and we're pleased. We're not satisfied because there's always room to grow, but we're especially proud of having a 91% pass rate in the area of writing and an 85.3% pass rate in reading. One of the challenges that we have experienced as a district, and I know all of you out there are probably experiencing the same thing, is that with the increase in demand for the use of data in decision-making under the RTI umbrella, just the sheer amount of work involved in collecting and in displaying the data so that it's right at the hands of the teachers that need it the most, what really has been very overwhelming. Our district spent some time evaluating commercial products that were available off the shelf for data management, and the short story is we decided that none of them did all of the things that we wanted them to do, that we wanted to be able to do, and so our solution has been to kind of enter this journey of designing our own online data collection and analysis tool that we call OASIS. So this is, I just wanted to share a screenshot. This is what our logon looks like. when we log on, what we can do is look at a student's performance over time. And what I want to point out is that you, as a person looking at this graph, can tell that this is a student who didn't make much progress from 4th grade all the way through the end of 8th grade. If you look along the bottom, and you'll see the grade levels in the FWS stands for fall, winter, and spring benchmark assessments. But you don't need to know anything else about what the exact assessments were that were given or what the student's actual scores were in order to be able to see that this student entered high school and began to make some really nice progress. And that was our goal. One of our goals in designing this system was that teachers would easily be able to tell how their students were doing without needing to have a master's level course in assessment. If you're a person who wants to know the details, though, you can go in and click below a graph and get the actual scores of a student, and this is what that looks like. This assessment happens to be MAP, Measures of Academic Progress, which you heard Casey refer to earlier, which, for those of you who aren't familiar with it, is an online computer adaptive test that results in a RIT score. So we're able to see the students' numbers and progress over time in this way as well. We have, of course, as I said, we're never satisfied. We have ongoing work. Our RTI leadership team here at Walla Walla High School is a very energetic group of people who are committed to doing the best that we can for our students here and in making Walla Walla High School a high-quality high school for all students.
One of the examples of that is, that how do we move forward? One of the ahas for us this year is that we were focusing on reading and math, and we realized when we started applying this three-tier model to our attendance, our discipline, our student failure rate, we realized that a large number of students are failing social studies, and that was an aha, because reading is directly the reason why they were failing. So we've approached the social studies department and began to have this conversation about tiered instruction in social studies. So there's a buy-in there. So our hope is to continue to grow this idea of catching kids when they're struggling in all content areas. And of course, one of the challenges and ongoing work is that the frequent progress monitoring, and how do we do that, and what do we do when they do meet the benchmark or have made the growth? Where do they go next? And that's probably biggest challenge at a high school level. That fluidity is not as available as middle school because of credits and because of 7-period days and all those other requirements that has to go with that. We're also working on expanding our academic lab next year, having that immediate assistance students who may not need to be in a tier 2 class, but they experience a period of time in their career a struggle. Maybe it's for 3 weeks. How do we provide a 3-week intervention to those kids? So we want to have a lab kind of setting. We have math lab right now that is an after school where kids can get specific math assistance when they need them. We want to expand it to all content areas and almost having tier systems within that academic lab so they can receive a variety of assistance as they need them.
Okay, that's all we have for today. Thank you.
Thank you, Mira, Casey, and Maria. Before we move on to questions, I'd like to give Dr. McMaster an opportunity to say a few words and specifically touch on the necessity of using CBMs as a progress monitoring tool in a high school.
Okay, well, this is Kristen McMaster again, and first I just want to say that I'm very happy to have had the chance to hear about the efforts at Walla Walla High School. It sounds like quite a tremendous effort that people have put a lot of thought and effort into, and sounds like you're doing very exciting things to help kids succeed, so that's quite impressive. In terms of whether CBM is necessary, again, I think going back to what the purpose is for doing RTI at the high school level and what kinds of information you're interested in collecting about kids are the critical things to consider with respect to what would be the most appropriate tools to use to monitor progress. I think the advantages of CBM are that there is a research base, and so we do have information about the reliability and the validity of the measures and whether they're really showing us what we would like to gain in terms of information from them. And again, kind of going back to the idea of quick, easy to administer, repeated measurement over time, which might address some of the issues about getting quick information to make decisions about whether kids are getting the right instruction and whether they should be moved to a different tier or receive different types of instruction. Another thought that came to mind is that in this particular example of Walla Walla High School, the measures that teachers are developing, Casey was talking about in the English classes that they've been working on, those might work really well in conjunction with CBM-type progress monitoring tools, where CBM could be used to determine that, or whether kids are responding to instruction, and when they are not making sufficient progress, I could see real value in those teacher-created tools to get more information about what is going on, what are the students struggling with, and what do they need more assistance with. So those are my immediate responses.
Thank you. I want to give our presenters an opportunity to answer some of the questions we received from our participants. If we do not get to your question, please remember that the answers will be posted following this webinar, not immediately, but sometime following the webinar. So first off, Kristen, Francis asked, do you recommend that the reading sample for a maze passage be from a state assessment or from a textbook at the grade level?
I would say taking passages from textbooks at the grade level probably makes the most sense. I have known teachers to use samples from state assessments just to give that kind of practice, but if we're kind of sticking to drawing from the curriculum, I would say to use the curriculum. So, yeah.
And Carol asked, is there a guide somewhere on how to interpret the results of MAZE, the CBM?
Well, I'm not exactly sure if I'm understanding the question correctly. So basically the results of the CBM MAZE are the number of correct selections that a student has made in the allotted time, so 2 to 3 minutes. And the way to interpret those data, MAZE data correlates strongly with other measures of overall reading proficiency. And we tend to think about it not really as a comprehension measure, but as an indicator of a kid's overall reading proficiency. So what you can do is then plot the scores on a graph over time, and if you see that the scores are increasing, the interpretation is that the student is improving in his or her overall reading proficiency. And if you don't see progress or you see a decrease in progress, then the interpretation would be that the student is not making progress and needs something more in terms of reading instruction. Again, that's where we need to dig further and find out what the specific problem is. I'm not sure if I'm answering the question directly, but that would be my response.
Okay, and along the same lines as MAZE, is there norms available for general education for the MAZE passages for high school?
Not to my knowledge at the high school level. The research is just not far enough along that norms have been developed. Although I think individual schools can develop their own norms by administering the measures widely and calculating their own norms, and that's probably at this point the best approach. And hopefully in the future there will be high school norms.
And along that same line, what would you recommend as a minimum sample size in order to create local norms or establish predictive validity of CBM measures?
Wow, that's a little out of my area of expertise, but I would say as large as possible, basically, is for getting a normative sample. I think the bigger the better, but I don't feel comfortable giving a specific number.
I understand that. And I would also recommend along that line multiple years, not using a single year for that.
Yep.
And just one more question for you, Kristen. Any suggestions for ELL students who've not been in the country long enough using CBM measures?
Yeah, that's a really good question and one that I'm actually specifically interested in. And actually, I have done a little bit of pilot work here in the Twin Cities area with ELL students at the high school level who are new to the country and oftentimes new to the schooling system. What we've done is look at reading or read aloud and maze measures, and we've done a little bit of sort of reliability and validity type work and looking at whether the measures are sensitive to growth. And for the population that I've worked with, which mainly consists of Somali, Hmong, and Hispanic students, we've actually found fairly decent technical characteristics of those measures for ELL students, but that's with relatively small samples. And I think one of the biggest concerns is whether ELL students, because their language difficulties might interact with their reading abilities in ways that we don't fully understand. We're not sure if we're getting the same kinds of information with the measures as we are with English-only students. But there is some research coming out in addition to the work that I've been doing. A woman named Hilda Ives Wiley has done some work in that area, more with middle school level students. Yeah, I think there's a few small studies on ELL students, but that's certainly an area where we definitely need more research.
Thank you. Walla Walla, I have a couple questions for you. How did you guys determine that the focus would be on reading?
I think part of the reason that we focused on reading was when we state exam, our graduation requirement actually started with students having to meet standards in reading and writing. In fact, math is not even quite a graduation requirement. There are more options for students who did not meet the standard in math, whereas in reading and writing there wasn't. They either had to meet standard to graduate or they didn't graduate. So urgency of making sure those kids met the standard really got us to focus on the reading as our number one. And there was more research on how to teach reading and how to get kids to read. So it was easier journey that way, and then we just expanded it to math.
Can you guys talk a little bit about why the school isn't using curriculum-based measurement at the moment?
This is Maria. I would say, as I shared with you, we actually are in our special education department, and the reason why we haven't grown that out to Tier 2 or standard classes is that we aren't there yet. Probably, as you could hear in all of the things that both Mira and Casey talked about, a lot of the work that has been done by Walla Walla High School has been about improving the core instruction to reduce the numbers of kids needing some kind of intervention, which is a need, I feel, of quality RTI work, because if we don't do that work, then we're trying to intervene with too large numbers of students and we max out our resources. So they have rightly emphasized their work on improving the core. And so, but as I shared at the beginning, we're beginning to talk about how we might incorporate the use of CBMs in our Tier 2 classes specifically. And one of the things that we have thrown about is using content area texts, for example, science science text or social studies text to make maze passages, and developing our own set of norms by administering those to our kids, to all of our kids who are participating in a certain class, so that we can see what a typical performance would look like to help us understand how our struggling readers are progressing related to their peers who are typically developing readers.
Okay. You guys mentioned several times MAP and HSTII. Can you just give a brief description of what those are?
The MAP is Measures of Academic Progress, and it's a commercially available computer-assisted or computer adaptive test. So the test that the kids take it online on the computer, and the test adapts itself as the kids progress, depending on items that they are successful on or items that they fail. And the resulting score is a RIT score. And HSTII is our state's new name for our high-stakes test. It used to be called the WASL, or Washington Assessment of Student Learning, and now it's called, at the high school level, HSTII, High School Proficiency Exam.
I have a question about your special education students and use of progress monitoring. So how often do you progress monitor those students who are receiving special education services?
Well, I will tell you that varies at this time and is kind of an area of emphasis. In fact, after this, I'm doing an in-service with our special education staff about benchmark assessment versus progress monitoring. So I'm telling you that to illustrate that all of this is a process. But at minimum, 4 times per year. And what I'm going to be talking with our staff about today is that I'd like them to use those 4 times per year as a benchmarking opportunity, and to more frequently in between use measures for progress monitoring so that they can adjust their instruction when kids aren't making progress.
So you guys mentioned you have an RTI team who reviews your data. Can you talk about how you chose your team and how long it took to get teachers on board at your school?
RTI team, actually, we had an informal RTI team that we met quite frequently, and they were teachers who were teaching Tier 2 classes. And as we moved through this journey, we saw the necessity of, we described it as pulling all the poles together. So we actually formed this team last summer, and we met together to develop some goals and what the purpose of this team was. And the team includes, there's a couple of administrators, we have a counselor, there's a special ed teacher on there, we have a school psychologist, and Maria from the district level is on that team. We've just recently involved our Gear Up facilitator who's going to be helping with academic support. So if we have an RTI program out there addressing needs, a member of that program is on this team. So when we're making decisions and looking at data to determine how do we proceed, all the thinking that is required, and all the stakeholders are sitting in the same room having the same conversation. And we love this team. And every time that we meet together, it's productive. It's we feel like we're having the right conversation about right things. And we meet once a week for 45 minutes. And so that's been our work.
Thank you. And I have one last question for either of you. Are there any other CBM tools for reading besides Maze? And what other CBM tools are available for measuring reading growth?
This is Maria from Walla Walla, and Kristen will be able to speak more knowledgeably about this than I will, but we just use Maze and oral reading fluency for kids who are much lower level readers at the high school level.
Right, and to my knowledge, at the high school level, those are the only CBM measures available for reading specifically. I mentioned the vocabulary matching measure, which has been used more to sort of gauge content area progress, but those are the typical reading measures.
We would like to thank Kristen McMaster, Mir Goebel, Casey Monahan, and Maria Garcia for sharing their presentations today. If you would like to print a copy of the PowerPoint slides from today's presentation, you may do so by clicking on the small printer icon at the bottom right-hand side of your screen. This will allow you to print the PDF. The slides will also be available on the websites of the National Center on Response to Intervention, the National High School Center, and the Center on Instruction. I would like to invite you to join us for future webinars where we will address specific topics related to scheduling in more depth. So check your inbox and our websites for details. We would appreciate your feedback about today's session. Please take a few minutes to complete the webinar evaluation that you see on the screen. We value your feedback, and ultimately your suggestions will assist us in making decisions for our future webinars. If you have additional questions about the implementation of tiered interventions and RTI in high school, please insert comments on the follow-up evaluation. Once again, thank you for participating today.